Wonderful good afternoon to Nigeria, Afghanistan, Belgium, and where you're from. Wonderful to have you online. I hope you are well. I hope you are healthy, and I hope your families are. That is the most important thing. Thank you so much for your time and your interest in this webinar again. This webinar is a small webinar, which means we've restricted members in this webinar to attend by number. We've reached that maximum number quite easily. The idea is that we have more of a conversation once this brief talk is over. The presentation is smaller, is more conceptual, so that we can dive into details and questions after this. So after the end of this webinar, the microphone will be enabled and muted, and we can have a conversation then. Let's dive right in of how to save actually an NGO and what leaders need to do in order to do so. Quick introduction. My name is Chris. I am, for my sins, the MD of MZ International, and my colleague Joseph cannot be with me here at the moment. He's on another client assignment, and my colleagues around the world are based in all sorts of countries. We have converted to become a 100% digital and remote organization before Corona. And as you know, our mission is to do good better, to help organizations be funded better, and to build better NGOs. That's pretty much our mission, and that includes turnaround management. Now, turnaround management is what we're talking today. We're talking about the challenges we have. Some NGOs do need saving. We're talking about how to think about this differently and the courage it takes to think differently, and then hopefully leave you with 3 concrete steps to stay income positive. I have more money than expenses, have more income than expenses, which is what turnaround ultimately is. Now we're gonna dive right in. This webinar, just a couple of remarks. This webinar is recorded. The recording will be published later. The slides will be shared with you, so you do not need to take frantic notes. I'm clearly outside today in what is probably the last nice autumn day here in Hamburg, so I hope the sound is all right. If you cannot hear me, please tell me in the chat very quickly so that I can change my audio settings. And finally, the conversation afterwards will not be recorded, so that we have, share a degree of confidentiality here within the group that is online, at least. Okay. Let's kick it off. There's a hell of a lot change and disruption happening. Our partners and friends at Interaction, the largest nonprofit association in the US, has done a survey last year. The results came out earlier this year, and it asked this really simple question saying, do you agree with the statement that the external operating environment is changing significantly? And as you can see right here, you know, the vast majority, more than 80%, says, yes, I really strongly agree, or I somewhat agree. So there is a lot of change here that the CEOs of NGOs in the world see, and that is certainly what we see as well. The business model of many non-profit organizations has to massively adapt or even transform in order to stay relevant. Many organizations have long discussed, but really are coming to recognize now that this over-reliance on institutional donors is just not viable. Excuse me. And that we need to flex in terms of our costing and our delivery capacities much faster than we have done in order to react to unforeseen circumstances like COVID. Donors policies, even if you still rely on them, changing rapidly. And there is so much competition in the sector right now between the nonprofits, from the social enterprises, and a whole host of other entrants, particularly the corporates, that creates a hyper-competitive environment in order to improve the world. That is also something new, and us NGOs have to deal with that. So there is a lot of change and disruption, and the question is, how do we cope with that? Now, my colleagues and I spend a lot of time with leaders and boards and management of organizations in order to build better NGOs. And that often means adapting how they work or even transforming in what they do. So fundamental restructuring projects happening there. And I hope that this presentation will give you some points that you might use in your daily work. Good. First of all, any change is achieved only when we change our mindset. And for leaders to achieve this turnaround, the number one thing that we can actually say is put all the facts on the table. That can be incredibly painful. For a leader to come clean, confess to the fact that the organization is financially not on a stable footing, needs to substantially change, or that there is some strategic major disruption happening is a problem. But putting the facts on the table objectively without judgment is the number one point to achieving any change in our organization. The second one is calling for a shared sacrifice with clear goals and timing, as well as doing so urgently. So a shared sacrifice could be a salary cut by the senior management, could be a reduction of holidays, could be a shaving of programs that we would love to keep but cannot financially, could be a reduction in the office space, but some sort of shared sacrifice that will not only relieve the financial situation, but also allow us to form a team and a culture of shared sacrifice around us in order to do the next step. And then finally, much more importantly, of course, is when we are in this collective will of changing, then we need to either adapt, which is innovate how things are done. So doing the same things better, more agile, faster, cheaper, and transform. I change what is being done. And in reality, most transformations that are proper and serious and well done are a combination of them both. They certainly always include the adapt part, and very, very often they include the transform part. Maybe you need to enter into a new market, maybe you need to enter a new country, a different kind of program, or you maybe actually retract from some that have been bleeding the organization dry for many years. Once we've clearly established the mindset, a lot is possible. And the thing that we need to realize here is that any turnaround requires a real culture change here too. It's not often mentioned by leaders and by turnaround consultants because culture change seems vague and soft and expensive and not something that one has time for, but it is absolutely essential. So I'm always lobbying for my clients and the CEOs and the management boards we talk with at the UN organizations or at the transnational NGOs, that we need to communicate the need to change the business model and the supporting culture in either in these two ways that I mentioned. Either we adapt it and or we transform it. And that honesty is really important. And like this little picture here mentioned, it either has to go the one or the other way. What we cannot no longer do is just continue the same way. And that creates a message that builds an alliance, that creates a preparedness to change that is otherwise just not there. This is obviously not the be all and end of all culture change. There is a lot more, but clearly communicating that we need to adapt and transform is absolutely essential. But quickly moving on, so we get to the conversation. How do we do it then? So we've came clean, we put the facts on the table, we are communicating a new mindset. What are we doing then? Well, it's pretty simple. First, we plan. You know, shocks, trends, and changing environments are always happening. They are happening at an increasing space. We need to have a plan in the drawer to see what do we need to do when. What are the trigger events that we need to make a substantial change, either financially and or operationally? We also need to be clear of the opportunity costs. What is the cost of doing nothing? And there's usually a big collective will to not change. And that's only human, that's only natural. But what are the costs and implications of that? And secondly, the plan needs to contain some sort of acknowledgement of what we need to know and what do we know already. So when you remember when COVID came up, or recently from the exodus from Afghanistan, when these things happened, listing out what we know and what we do know creates a common understanding and is essential for any good plan to be put in action. The next step in saving an NGO really is just to think. And it sounds a little bit simple, but it's really important to take that time. Think intentionally about your leadership in your organization, about the business model and culture you need, and also the business model and culture that got us into this difficult situation. And then, yes, think about the finances. The biggest challenge of any turnaround and any saving and restructuring process in the nonprofit is that we start at the bottom, at the finances part. People usually leave it to that. The finances, however, are only the symptom of how we manage. How we lead, how we operate, and how we relate to each other is absolutely original, absolutely the basis of everything we do, and that leads to certain financial outcomes. So for anybody who says we don't have time to now think about our leadership model or think about the difference between adapting and transforming, I would say that's a difficult strategy, because how we operate is a reflection of how our finances stand. And finally, obviously, we need to start, act. Sometimes in a matter of hours, sometimes in a matter of weeks only, sometimes it takes several months, depending on the organization. And as I mentioned, there need to be clear sacrifices, clear deadlines, and clear metrics. Metrics is an obvious one. I cannot change what I cannot measure. And metrics are super important. More than happy to talk about this later in the conversation. The sacrifice we've mentioned already, and the deadlines, I think that's self-explanatory. Again, happy to talk about it after these few slides. Good. I hope that gives you a little bit of an insight. Now let's have a quick step back and say, okay, what is financial distress? Very simply put, financial distress is usually created by organizational inefficiencies, some practices or programs where simply the expenses exceed the income. So the red line is higher than the green line. That's pretty much what it is. A good turnaround cannot turn around immediately, but it gets better over time. And sometimes here's the sacrifice where the expenses are being cut. The distress is usually driven by longer term trends and has a root in the strategy and in the management issues we've just mentioned. That is why I've mentioned these management issues up front and first, because they are usually coming from a historic long-term development. It's really important to have those on the radar, even though immediately in the situation where we are running a financial deficit, it is really tempting to just cure the finances by cutting costs and increasing income. The immediate distress can also, and we have seen this a lot last year, be caused by a sudden shock, by a sudden change in income, or in fact, the ability to operate. Many of our partners who operated in Afghanistan up to a month ago have suddenly discontinued all their programs. Of course, we have a participant from Afghanistan here on the webinar today. That is has financial consequences, very, very real financial consequences. That can be an immediate distress sign where, you know, some advice would be useful sometimes. However, the simple fact is, even if we are a very good, well-run, agile organization, the distress is often outside the control of the organization and then exacerbated by poor planning and bad safety nets internally. So the serenity prayer really comes into play here. We have to accept what we cannot change and have the courage to change what we can. In my experience over the last 15 years, I would certify the fact that if we do our best at influencing what we can influence, then the stuff that we can't influence will sort itself out. Good. So how do we do it? Well, apart from the plan, control, and evaluation part, we have to first realize, what is it? What's the situation? A financial distress means strained financial resources, increased donor scrutiny, which is time consuming, sort of demoralized management, concerned employees, and really, really struggling beneficiaries. And the last bullet point is the most important one. Financial distress of an NGO means that the beneficiaries, those we are supposed to help, are affected first. That's exactly what's happening now in Afghanistan, for example, due to an external shock event, in this case, the takeover of the Taliban there. And it is the beneficiaries that we are supposed to help who are suffering the most. They are often felt across the full range of departments: HR, finance, policy, communications, leadership, the board, the trustees, all of them. So there's a sort of mutual demoralization as well as a shock. And by looking at these 3 steps, it can help a leader to put a plan into action and to work with the organization, with those people who have this shock event, and put a plan that has some success of achieving into action very fast. Now let's have a quick look at it. First of all, we really want to start with where we are at. We need a clear understanding of where the problems are. So a good financial analysis can show us within a few days where the losses are coming from. You might think you may know the losses, but doing a proper financial analysis gives you that pinpointed idea. You want to really examine all the activities and the operations. Are there offices that are continuously underperforming, have been underperforming for years or even decades? We see this time and time again with our clients, where a certain program type or a certain region or a certain office is just producing one loss after the next, but is still being approved for a budget the next year. And then obviously, yes, there is a personnel review. Over time, program staff can sort of become core department. Is that intentional? Is it not? Either is fine, but it needs to be clear. The departments can swell. They don't contract back again when the program have gone away. And with the overheads only go in one direction, and the revenue and the income goes in the other direction, and that will cause a distress point at some point. So the evaluation needs to be swift, it needs to be thorough, it needs to be robust, and the organization as a whole is the goal of this process. We have seen this in another organization recently, where the leadership basically tried to curtail it to one department that was creating a loss, but that is really not very helpful. It needs to be the organization as a whole. Good, moving on. Obviously, that engagement is super keen. So I'm sorry, I jumped too fast there. The number 1 step in any turnaround, in any evaluation stage, is to just meet a lot with staff, beneficiaries, be open and honest with donors, with the management itself, and with the governance institutions. The last thing you want in any turnaround situation, in any area where you are changing fast, is more surprises. So I would immediately engage with them and be open with what we don't know yet. The second one is taking control. So creating a daily cash flow report, tracking all the spending, approving each expenses, switch to lower cost vendors, evaluating our staffing needs, making the hard choices there when necessary is absolutely essential. We've done this with our NGO partners, sometimes over 3 months, sometimes in a space of a week, because it was necessary. There's benefits for both. Then we'd like to review all the program services offered and end programs or reduce the cost of delivery to those which have not a chance of ever turning themselves around, or where we are not fulfilling our own quality expectations. And yes, then again, the engagement, let's inform all the stakeholders on any action and ask for their support after implementing these changes. That is really essential. Otherwise, the turnaround will definitely fail. And finally, putting that plan into action. So we obviously have a reserves policy here, where we feed off our reserves. If down here is 0, in any turnaround management, you see them usually going down. The thing you really want to do is put a floor underneath, making sure this is the deepest, the lowest level of reserves we will accept in order to then have a plan for this to be increased. What we see over and over with many organizations is that they do a turnaround half willingly, half-wittingly, and their reserves degrade a bit, and then they stay stable, and then the next crisis hits and it goes down again, and then they stay stable, and then the next crisis hits and they go down again. So that is obviously a badly affected turnaround. So we definitely want to include the advisory board, get help support from them, bring our key employees together, and make this also an opportunity to create a collaborative development strategic plan, use the crisis to your advantage, build a new and agile organization that can flex over time and withstand the shocks of the future. After all, you know, every crisis is also a good opportunity, and we wouldn't want to waste one. Finally, and I know this sounds counterintuitive, there is the subject of investment. A cash flow crisis is obviously by definition cash strapped. So we have a reduction in cash in the short term, but maybe not in all organizational reserves. We have seen organizations and we have accompanied organizations who've invested themselves out of a crisis. They couldn't really save the failing organization, but they've effectively built a new one through this. And that was obviously very energizing as well as positive in the end. That is always an option. And we call it, by the way, a phoenix. So out of the ashes, something new arises. But that's pretty much it. As I said, we kept this very, very brief, very, very short. The idea is that we enter a conversation right now. Just a few final remarks for those who are interested. There are additional events coming up on the website on the 14th of October. I think that is next week. Yeah. There is something more pragmatic, financial planning in uncertain times. So in these times we are. And then on the 27th, there is hopefully something that you can join in again, building an NGO in this new normal, how we create an agile, innovative, entrepreneurial, and digital organization that can actually deliver the Sustainable Development Goals.